Hello, and welcome to another episode of Legends of Land Rights. We're in the heart of Redfern today, and across my shoulder is the Old Black Theatre site. In this episode, we're showcasing Tiga Bayles. Tiga Bayles is legendary in his fight for social justice, his fight for land rights, and his fight for the well-being of Aboriginal people right around the world. Tiga was instrumental in helping to establish the Tent Embassy in Canberra, and then went on to become the Chairperson of the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. Today, Tiga still fights for social justice and can be seen and heard all around Australia on his radio show. Tiga, welcome to the program. You've been involved now for quite some time, and particularly in the early days with Aboriginal land rights in Sydney. It's now the 30th anniversary. What do you remember most, or what was your involvement back there then?
Yeah, thanks, Ol. It's certainly an honour to be a part of the program. Those early days, I suppose, we're talking about, well, we can go back to the 70s here in Brisbane when we were marching on the streets to smash the Queensland Act, which was so oppressive and controlling of our mob, and demanding access to land. Land rights was one of our catch cries. Fairly brutal sort of stuff from the police when there was that confrontation. The 72 Embassy, again, the Tent Embassy down there, brutal. But I think what sticks out most, Sol, is we were mobilising ourselves. We as First Nations people were prepared to get up and push for change. And it saw some real serious demonstrations. Some of the earlier stuff here was the Springbok tours, which was quite violent. And that was the late 60s, 1970. And then there's the land rights movement in New South Wales, with the New South Wales Land Rights Act being legislated in 1983, the interim land council being set up in 81, I think it was, when we were organising down there. Some great memories about in that period.
If I can just move you back a bit, 1977 was one of the biggest meetings we had back there in those days with Aboriginal people, and yourself together with Kevin Cook. And I think you and Cookie, prior to that, was always talking about Aboriginal land rights, having Aboriginal land, and there was a Aboriginal football knockout, and we had delegates that came in, and I don't know, I think you may have chaired it or Cookie may have chaired the meeting, but that to me was the embryo for what's now the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. You actually, in actual fact, you were the first CEO of the Land Council.
I was elected chair of New South Wales Land Council in 87 after Tombo Winters. But you and myself and Cookie were three of the first executive for the Metropolitan Land Council in Redfern. And we attended regional council meetings for Sydney, Newcastle region, and then the state meeting. We had But the interest, the commitment of our people in New South Wales from all those communities from around who were prepared to stand up and speak out and take on positions that were available. I mean, overnight, with that New South Wales land rights legislation enacted, we became landlords because of the transfer of housing from the Lands Trust, I think it was, went across to each local land council. And not many of us had any experience in this area. So to be prepared to put your hand up and say, yeah, well, I'll stand for nomination as chair or secretary or regional rep. I mean, that sort of commitment, I think, was great.
In fact, you had Aboriginal people themselves that was against land rights, because the people that were involved were people that was associated with the so-called Black Power movement, that a lot of our own mob were frightened to get involved and thinking it was some sort of communist...
militant mob?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, well, we're like, I suppose, most other groups, where there's that diversification or diversified interests and views and things like that. But we knew what we were in for.
But how was it as the chairperson? How was it being a chairperson of a newly formed Aboriginal Land Council?
It was tough going because we had the state government at the time. Nick Greiner was the Premier, gunning for control. He didn't like the New South Wales Land Council having the power and the money. I think in those days when I was the chairperson, the budget might have been about 15 million. And now 50% of that had to be invested and 50% was for distribution. But Greiner tried everything to take control, and he eventually did. After after my term as chairperson, he eventually did take control and took the status of statutory body from each local land council and each regional land council and placed it in the hands of one, New South Wales Land Council. It's the only statutory body, I believe. But I was the youngest. I was about 33, 34, 35. I was only a young fella when I was elected chairperson. And there were other young people elected on that New South Wales Land Council board with me. Monica Morgan, Robert Carroll, to name a few, Danny Chapman, Ray Craigie. We were all young fellas, and we still had some of the older fellas on the board with us, like William Bates.
I think Aussie Cruz. Lyle Munro Senior.
Yeah, no, Lyle wasn't on there, but Manuel Ritchie
Tom
was
Briggs.
on there. Tommy Briggs wasn't there then. But so there was a good mix. So there was good, strong energy from the young ones, and then some of the older ones with the experience and that to balance out. But it was a great experience for me as being the chairperson of that land council. I learnt a hell of a lot, and in those days we were given an honorarium. If I had to attend a meeting down at Camaraganja, for example, as a chairperson of the land council, I would be given an honorarium, and we were given a car and a petrol card that kept the cars on the road. But there wasn't a wage or a salary like that. It was a voluntary capacity, you know. But I visited virtually every Koori community in New South Wales, and became very articulate in understanding that land rights legislation. But the beauty of it was here was a legislation that gave us the framework for self-determination. That was the beauty of it. And the fact that there was a small amount of money for each local land council for its operational budget, not only paid for a coordinator and maybe a car if you were lucky, and the rental costs of your office space, didn't pay for much more than that. But the fact that it gave us the framework for self-determination to be able to implement programs and projects in communities that would build the capacity, build the expertise, build the capacity of our mob, that was the greatest the challenge, or one of the greatest outcomes, I thought. Because it also was, and I still believe, it was then, the New South Wales Land Rights Act was then, and I believe still is, probably the best land rights in the country. Now, you don't have too many to measure up against. There's the Northern Territory Commonwealth legislation. That's probably it. I don't know if anybody else has got the Land Rights Acts.
The Pitt Homelands have got their...
Pitch and Darramop? Right.
Yeah.
But so New South Wales Land Rights Act still is way out in front as far as being the best around.
Yeah, and you've got a number of other ones, of course, you know, Kimberley.
Across the country.
Yeah, some here in Queensland.
Yes, we do have.
That are not... So when you look around now, where is land rights today? I mean, when you look back of those heady days before any legislation, when it was just talking, when there was marches, even prior to the Northern Territory land rights legislation, where do you believe we are today as far as land rights is concerned?
Probably gone backwards, I feel. Probably gone backwards. You don't hear land rights being mentioned as the term today. We might hear sovereignty, we might hear treaty, but it's taken a different twist, a different angle. I think it's still important, I think it's essential. We must have access and control of some of our own land. There's no question about that. So there's no question about our sovereignty. And self-determination is still the key. But we don't hear some of those terms like land rights, self-determination, and there's a few others that we just don't hear.
Culture, heritage.
Yeah, we don't hear a lot of that. And that was the other thing with that Land Rights Act of New South Wales, that it did give us some control and some say in our cultural heritage, our sites. And the opportunity to buy properties. Winteriga out there at Wilcannia. I think that was the first property the New South Wales Land Council
Terry
bought.
Hi in Moree.
Terry Hi in Moree?
Well, that was the first one that was handed
Right,
back.
right.
You had the national park at Broken Hill. But yeah, I mean, those were those days where, you know, local land councils would band together on that regional level, put their money in the one pot and go and buy a motel,
Exactly.
go and buy a cattle
Yes.
station, go
Yep,
and,
go and buy a sheep station. Yeah. Yes, and that's what I ended up working out at after my term as chair. I went out and worked beside Les Trindle at Canberra in that northwest region, and they had 2 or 3 sheep stations out there. And you know, there were some great opportunities there where they put together a training program for young Koori. They were all men, males, to actually learn about working on the land, learn about sheep, running a sheep station. They were going to TAFE College. That sort of thing was good. There were market gardens set up. There was, I remember up at Gosford there, now Sydney Newcastle Regional Council, there was a big bulldozer that was bought for use on the communities within the regional council.
The Land Council itself now in New South Wales, I mean, what the legislation to date, 2013, 30 years on, has bought is in actual fact over $600 million in the statutory fund and over $1.3 billion worth of land holdings throughout New South Wales. I mean, it's not that much, but it's, you know, still a long way to go. But what do you think? It's an enormous build on from, you know, what somebody like yourself has come through.
From where we were, it's an enormous achievement, because at the same time, all of this work, year after year after year, these achievements, you've always had the state government there trying to sort of pull the mat out from underneath you. It always happens. So in spite of these challenges and threats by state government to amend the legislation again, to amend the regulations again, to tighten the control or restrict the buying power of the Land Council, in spite of that, they've still been able to acquire some prime pieces of land, some by land, by the land claims process, and some by straight out purchase.
But Tiga Bayles just didn't stay. Well, Tiga Bayles just didn't stop with the land rights question. In actual fact, you were very instrumental in the Tent Embassy. As we know it today, electronic media, particularly in the area of radio, through Murray Gemma, I think it was, down at the Old Black Theatre. What were your thoughts then? Here you were, a very young person at the time, and all these things happening, medical services, legal services, housing companies, children's services. You took it that step further and said, well, you know, the media, let's have a look at that.
Yeah, well, the media was important for us to tell our own story, and to get the opportunity to be able to, me and my mother, Maureen Watson, I think we got 10 minutes a week first up on one of the stations in Sydney, a community station, and that grew to an hour a week, and then we got another station that offered us some 10 hours a week at Radio Skid Row. So Mother was the one that pulled me into that and said, we must be able to tell our own stories. We must be able to articulate our own identity, our history, our experiences, and our aspirations. And the best way for us to do that is by being in control of our own media. And that led us to growing the number of hours that we were broadcasting on air and setting up Radio Redfern, having people, Max Silver, Danny Slater, Cheryl Rose, Linda Burney, the name goes on my kid's mother, Kathy Riley.
Well, indeed, Gary Foley.
Gary Foley.
Cut his teeth in
Gary
media
Foley on
down
Radio
at
Redfern, you know.
Radio Skid Row.
That's right, yes, yes. So to have people from community being able to articulate the community's aspirations and experiences. I mean, these were days when we had the Black Mariahs outside the Empress Hotel and down at the other one down near the Raglan there.
The Clifton.
The Clifton and stuff. There were some so-called riots, you know. We were able to talk about this, to be able to even name some of those police that were involved. That was a big step for us. But when we got our own licence here in Brisbane, I came up to Brisbane to work for Murray Country, or AAA Murray Country, is now known as 98.9 FM. My uncle, Ross Watson, said to me, and he was the one that orchestrated the licence, pardon me, the licence application. He said, we're going to have to think about things differently. We're no longer on air just for a few hours a week. We're now broadcasting across the metropolitan area of Brisbane. We need to be able to present our programming in a way that's not going to have people turn off. So we haven't got our backs against the wall. We still had our backs against the wall like we did back in the 70s and early 80s. But then in the early 90s, when we got the licence up here, we decided to not be too offensive, to curb our language a little bit, but still get the message across that we as First Nations people are the supreme environmentalists. We are the supreme conservationists. And if you want to make changes in this country for the better of future generations, you must engage with First Nations people. They're the ones with the ancient knowledge. So to be able to turn our thinking around a little bit and the way we presented and promoted ourselves, that was different. But I think it was good because we're still doing it today and we've got a big mainstream settler society audience with our station here, as well as our own mob.
And I suppose that's a lesson learned from your early days in Redfern, that the whole land rights movement, the whole medical service, the legal services, etc., nobody was upset. 30 years down the track of land rights, there's been no backyard that's been claimed.
Exactly.
Swimming pools are still intact. And it's just, to me, just a flow on from, you know, like you're on radio. You could make it. And I think I've seen quite a few radio stations, Aboriginal radio stations, that have sort of just pushed the Aboriginal thing there and there and there, and they're no longer around. Yeah.
We have been fortunate to grow a network of some 120 community stations in First Nations communities, Torres Strait, mainland. We've been fortunate in that regard, but it's a hell of a lot of work in being able to keep that programming professional, high standard, and to be able to promote that which is of importance to our community and not be forced to sort of compromise yourselves too much or don't rock the boat because the government funding might be at risk. Some of our mob think along those lines. Some of us will say, if they pull the funding, we'll keep this radio station going anyway. So it's exciting times today, I think.
You know, in Sydney in those days, we had a lot of people that came down from Queensland, yourself being one of them. I think 20 odd years you were there. At the time the legislation went through, Pat O'Shane, it was in actual fact the CEO of the Ministry for Aboriginal Affairs at the time. Did you feel strange, sort of, you know, there was all the things going on in Queensland. How did it feel being, well, at the forefront of Aboriginal self-determination, living in Sydney and doing all these things?
It was different, Sol, for me. There was different feelings. I suppose first up I was a refugee, taking refuge in New South Wales from the Bjelke Peterson regime here. Getting grabbed by coppers and bashed and pulled over in your car every second day saying the car's stolen, all this sort of stuff that was taking place in that mid-70s. And then I got to Redfern in 76, 77. And I got questioned and pressured by some of the local Kooris or Kooris in Redfern that had moved in from other parts of the state. And what are you doing down here? You're a Queenslander, you know, you should be back home. Well, hang on, brother, where are you from? Oh, you're from out of town, are you? From another part of New South Wales? So this is not your country either, where we are. And besides that, I'd met up with a local woman, we had a bunch of kids. And she was one of her family, Kath Riley's family, was one of the first half a dozen families that had been moved into Redfern. So I had the interests of my young ones, my children, my missus, but
there was that neutrality about Redfern itself that...
there was, because a lot of us had come from all different places. And the fact that we're all there for almost the same cause, and that was to improve the lot of our mob, to try and do better than what we had, to make some changes with government policy, with access to land. A lot of us were there to set up the legal services and the health services.
That did go national.
Yes, yeah, and today there's great national networks of all of those services, which is testimony to the need, the validity of people actually making the effort to say, we've got to set up these services. Here we are some 40 years later, and they're still going strong.